start very quick, but we have many things to talk. We have many precious guests that I would like to give a mic. So we will start with the first panel of the Friday. I would like to present our dear speakers, and first our dear moderator. I'm very happy that you already had the time to get to know each other, so maybe the thing that I'm going to say you already know, but I would like to mention the people that we have, the valuable people that we have here. Firstly, I would like to introduce our dear moderator, Antoine Gobet. I'm sorry if I pronounce your surname. Sorry in advance. So, Antoine Gobet is an affiliate professor of humanities in ESCP, and he's a valuable contributor, member of ECPS too. It's very hard for you to remember, but you can see that he is one of the main contributors of the program too. He's in the director in ESCP's Paris office and director of international affairs in Île-de-France Paris Rectorate.
You're right.
Okay. And the first speakers of the day is going to be Professor Jasiecki, Professor Krzysztof Jasiecki. And he is going to talk about populism as a reaction to neoliberal technocratism. Normally, as you can see, the first speaker will be the Professor Ozturk, but we will give the floor first to Professor Jasiecki because of his personal conditions. And the second speaker will be Professor Ibrahim Ozturk. He's going to talk on the nature of economics and the future of globalization under civilizational populism. And the third speaker of the day is going to be Dr. Valentina Auschland-Scheider. Sorry again. And she is going to present her research on far-right populism and making of the exclusionary neoliberal state. So thank you again for your interest. I would like to give the floor and mic to my dear colleague, Antoine.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm also an optimistic guy, like a minister. And I come from a country where a candidate to be president has been stopped by the judges some months ago. So we could be optimistic. And this candidate was absolutely fascinated by globalization. And she was a good example of what populism can think about globalization, because she thought that being against, she could be elected. And of course, it was one of the steps maybe she would never reach. So I am optimistic also because we don't have any statues. Yesterday, my colleague in charge of the debate about religion were helped by the statue of Moses, and the one in charge of feelings were helped by the statue of La Pietà. So I thought that maybe we will have a statue of Adam Smith here in this biblioteca, but there are no statue of Adam Smith, so I will try to do my duty without these statues, but I'm so pleased and so honored to moderate this panel today. Maybe 3 words to begin. First of all, as I said, we are used to observing populism with this idea that all the candidates, they could be left-wing, or they could be right-wing, or they can be center-wing. They are all against globalization because they are in reaction. Because it's a fact, we are in a globalized world, as they are against, they could only be against globalization. So it's a priori what we could think. But it's very interesting to observe that we have now a lot of leaders who stay in power. And so they stay in power, they are populists, so they are obliged to adapt to globalization. So they can't be only adversary of foe of globalization. And third things, of course, our world is changing because of this opportunity of some populist leaders to impose their ideas. As it was mentioned, I'm very lucky because my job is to organize exchanges. So I am apparently an actor of globalization. But I organize exchanges of students. And yesterday, and I'm particularly of foreign students. And yesterday, when President Trump decided to stop the opportunity of Harvard University to be able to welcome foreign students, I was totally astonished, but not surprised, because it's a way to think the globalization, because he is the voice, the speaker of protectionism. He thinks that all exchanges has to be stopped, particularly when they are against his idea. So probably the globalization itself is to be changed by these leaders, and that's probably what we have to discuss also. Not only to discuss about the reaction against globalization, but also to be able to foresee what the future could be with such kind of leaders. So to help us probably about these 3 points, first of all, the floor will be to Professor Jasiecki. It's a beginning of all, the reaction probably to neoliberalism. And of course, this word of neoliberalism is always a concept, because as I said, we don't have any statue of Benjamin Constant, any statue of Jean-Baptiste Say, or any statue of Adam Smith. But neoliberalism is not exactly what the liberals wanted to have as a hopeful word. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. One comment about the Polish presidential election. Our problem is that we have coalition pro-democratic movements and parties, but it's too much sometimes, do you know? Now our coalition is left, moderate, conservative and liberal parties, and we have many candidates from this coalition in this election. Do you know, they fighting each other. It's very problematic situation. And another, for ministry is no good speak open about this question, but this government is non-effective because this conflict is like Germany coalition, you know, with Scholz. It's a big problem for us that this populist language give for our liberals possibility go to power, but they do it many postulate like populist for money, for different questions, and in practice it don't exist because they have many political problems in government. It is big chance for authoritarian populists like Kaczynski and so on. It's a very interesting situation, very important for another countries, that after collapse of authoritarian rules is very problematic government for the future, because, for example, a chief president of central bank is from peace in many people in different places, and when you want by democratic way changes the situation, it's formally impossible by constitution. And at the moment we have this kind of situation. Yes, my topic is populism as a reaction to neoliberal technocratism. Maybe the one notice about church, because in Poland Catholic Church is very conservative and have influence in countryside, province and small cities. And we have big problem that generally big cities support liberals, but countryside, province, especially some of voivodeship connected with Ukraine and Belarus is completely different. They support strong leader. Just a moment. Yes, domination of technocracy and the concept of populism. The populist critic, main arguments of the neoliberal version of technocracy in Western countries, there was this technocratic approach is symbolized in Poland. Donald Tusk is another problem because he have government many years. His style was like Angela Merkel, personally. It's big problem that we haven't new leaders in more progressive narratives, and for example, for young people, Donald Tusk is like old man, not support for them. Neoliberal version of technocracy, he symbolizes is the rule of expert, especially economists, because the first point started for Donald Tusk was strong liberal against communist. It's a little party like Viktor Orban, but another case. The first was strong liberal. After them, a little bit changes, but he was leader of Liberal Party. Especially economists who colonized all areas of life. But such government don't serve for all society, but mainly for elites. And we have problem that our main candidate for liberal, president of Warsaw, is from a point of view of countryside, is typical man of elites. Doctor political science, many languages and so on. Here, his father was leading jazzmen in Poland. It's for me it's good, but for people from province, it's completely different. This approach has prevailed for the past 4 decades, generally in Poland too. Like Balcerowicz, it's this connection. I define populism as the style of anti-establishment political action rather than a coherent philosophy or ideology. But in this moment we generally haven't coherent philosophy and ideology, and like internet and social media do it for people is completely not clear. The key feature of contemporary populism can be considered many dimensions, like protest against the status quo in the name of the people. And our liberal main candidate said that we have stabilization. But situation is completely different because it's war, many crises and so on. People conceived as homogeneous, we know that it's not true. But for people in countryside and province, many want only one point of view in political sense. Dichotomic view of society, conspiracy theories, moralistic indignation, polarization, and politics of fears. The same problem have our liberal parties that we have war when in Ukraine. When you have war, normally that more support is for right parties, strong leaders and so on. Unfortunately, we have this situation. Populism against elite, institution and expert. For example, like in peace, is generally few people from good education. Most of them is people from, countryside and province, but for them is possibility go to success, go to Warsaw, to parliament, to government and so on. And part of them have strong support in this place like countryside, because for them is only one possibility, to go to the power. Mostly exclusionary nationalists. At the moment we have problem that Poland is no country with big emigration, but now we have this kind of emigration from Ukraine, and for many people is a new big problem, and many years our TV and media government by peace and then connected people with them they do it. Many images from Germany, France, and other countries that immigration is big problem, conflicts like in war in cities and so on. For people in province is fear that this situation will be in Poland. There is this mythology, but people said that is possibility. In this case, populism is partly product of neoliberalism. Why? Contemporary populism can be understood as critical reaction to neoliberalism, especially his low effectiveness in solving structural problems, especially in post-communist countries, because it's not only political change in the system, but economy. For example, many millions unemployments, and populists said because we going to European Union and globalization, we have such problems. But generally, these problems he's himself created, but liberals, such as opening to migration, deindustrialization, increase in domestic inequality and social cleavages. For Poland, most of them is completely new problems. Populism is a counter-reaction against the economic liberalism like Karl Polanyi. Populism serves as a functional equivalent of tendency that Polanyi defined as a counter-reaction against the economic liberalism that excessively destabilizes the organization of production, society, and the natural environment. Why systemic alternatives for today? This big problem. In the 30s, such counter-reaction produced Keynesian New Deal in the US, fascism and Nazis or communism in Europe, and the variants in other countries of the world as Japan, Argentina, and so on. The global financial crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, the strategic competition between the US and China, and rising international tensions have proven that profound institutional changes are needed. State authoritarian capitalism like China, or organized capitalism in the Nordic style, or surveillance capitalism like Zuboff, for example, is a famous book about this new possibilities. The concept of technocratic separation of powers can be compromised in multi-crisis. The concept of technocratic separation of powers, for example, the independence on central bank, this is example of important institutional change. Because liberals, they do it the same kind of policy, but now we know the strategy is not working. Another example concerns the relationship between different segments of the elite, especially connected with business elites and political elites. We have rebalance relationship between political elites and business elites is being rebalanced in the wake of the critique of neoliberalism. Since the pandemic, state power has increasingly subordinated capital to itself. It's very important because it's politics like Donald Trump's, and this policy influence to the Poland too. For example, Donald Tusk said that we must do repolonization or our industry, or we must do it economic dictator in Poland. Liberals said, open this kind of text, or including businessmen to government to changes the law. It's completely effect of Trump from United States. Another problem, the need to strengthen the nation state. Multi-crisis confirmed Deni Rodrik thesis that market hyperglobalization, limiting the role of the nation state, has gone too far. The opposite trend is currently taking place in many, and generally on the world. It has become necessary to significantly strengthen state institutions and public policies in terms of supporting national economies, social functions, reducing inequalities and social exclusion. In this problem in Poland, because many people don't believe the Liberal Party does this kind of politics. At the moment, Donald Tusk said the yes, but do you know, it's not simply a question, because many years he did completely different politics. This thesis was developed in the concept of trilemma, is Roderick. According to this concept, there are contradictions between the rationality of market hyperglobalization, political democracy, and economic development at the national level. These contradictions make it impossible for these three aspects of development to coexist permanently on an international level without significant institutional adjustment at the level of a nation state and in the system of the institutions of global capitalism. Is serious discussion in level on EU, what we must doing in this completely new situation. However, the functioning of markets may be primarily embedded in countries that have the instrument to implement their own stable development strategies. But in Poland we have problem because political conflicts have in practice aspect that own stable development strategies don't exist. We don't have a strong discuss about this question because the first is political problems. To create rules that protect against various shocks, technological, climatic, geopolitical changes, and so on. A stronger role for the nation state is protecting the national economy from the liberalizing forces of globalization, such migration, trade, financial crisis, deindustrialization, and so on. Is supported by people who voted for Brexit in the UK, for Trump in the US. We have partly the same problem connected with globalization for agri-sector imports from Ukraine, for example. Post-liberal institutional adjustment. What kind of organized capitalism is for my point of view, is main problem. A manifestation of institutional adjustment in nation states is currently state-driven capitalism, especially in large emerging markets in China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on. Elements of such adjustment are also clearly present in Western countries. The new direction is termed as organized capitalism with stronger focus on the national level, inform the rise of right-wing populist parties, protectionism, industrial policy, and the erosion of liberal institutions in an international level too. The populist intensification is a response to decades of undemocratic liberal practices, including the transfer of power to the technocratic supranational level, like EU, capital market, and so on. In Poland, this big problem, like in another post-communist countries, because we were this kind of situation in relation from Russia. And after them, we going to new world where capital markets is the first for our prime ministers, government, and so on. Another question, that period was the coronavirus pandemic has become a pretext for the political elites of many countries, not only in Poland, to follow the Chinese example and test how far they go in the restriction civil liberties. In Poland we have the same discussion, we must, because war and so on, we must support the army, police and so on. The real question is how to rebalance the national and international economic system, give excluded groups a greater voice, rebuild national social contracts, and focus global negotiations on areas where the potential economic gains are still large. In this case, we have a big problem because we have polarization and no national social contracts. Organized capitalism may open a wider option for societal influence on the economy, but much will depend on whether domestic political forces and intergovernmental cooperation will be able to manage the tensions arising from the current development on capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. No, you put on the table a lot of questions concerning the future of the state and the way people can define themselves in a world totally changing, where globalization has many aspects and where the liberal answer could be sometimes undemocratic. Yeah. And it's a very important point, and we had this debate yesterday with Irina von Wiese, because I was absolutely not agree when she said it was our failure in a preliminary speech, but in fact she was also a little bit right, because of course, as you described, we had some reaction of our liberal which could be criticized really by people. So, Professor Ozturk, it's now you to explain, maybe in this strange world we are living in, why the optimism.
How long are you going to stay with us?
10 minutes.
10 minutes then?
So maybe we could. Sorry, you didn't precise that. So if you have some questions to Professor Jasiecki. So I'm sorry for Professor Ozturk, and I'm sorry for Professor Ausalad Scheider, but we will begin by the questions.
We should help.
Yes, yes.
So yes, Irina, the floor is yours.
Should I take the microphone? Or should I talk?
One second, you can keep it. I'll bring it. You can keep it.
There is another microphone, so don't hesitate.
I have a loud voice, but I think it is for online purposes. Thank you very much, Professor. Really, really interesting. As a practicing politician, I hear that criticism of our liberal democracies almost daily on the doorstep. And yes, I stand by my words. I think it is a failure, not so much in our democratic liberal view and values, but it's a failure in communication, but also I think a failure in taking with us the people who are suffering perceived or actual relative deprivation. You will be familiar with Matthew Goodwin's thesis of the 4 Ds of populism, which start with distrust, deprivation, de-alignment, and destruction. And so my question is, one option that I have been exploring in my practical as well as theoretical work is hyperlocalism, moving the authority, moving the decision making away from the elite in their ivory tower in Warsaw or Paris or London to the local authorities, the local councils, giving them more of a say and giving therefore people more of a enfranchisement, of an empowerment over their daily life. This is something that I'm really interested in your views. Is it a possible systemic solution, or at least pointing in the right way? Thank you.
It depends. Normal situation. The first is consequences of our presidential election, because when go to the Nawrocki, we have come back to power peace, and discussion about reform will be very complicated. But at the moment, we have situation 50-50 in this case, and problem that no serious discussion about future of our political system, economic system, because it's only war between two main parties, 20 years. Tusk contra Kaczyński. Do you know, it's for academician, for example, is very bad, because when I go to the conferences, I discuss this question. The first problem is I am supporter to Tusk or Kaczyński. It ended serious discussion. But problem is more structural and so on, because after Balcerowicz plan, liberal reforms Poland, we have big success, but another way we have big polarization. And for these people, for losers, is bad party is populist, like PiS, like in other countries. And these people who have government in Poland now, I was support them, I'm advisor to Minister of Education and so on. But we have paradoxes. For example, I support integration children from Ukraine in Poland school. But liberal candidates, Trzaskowski, said that we must take money for them. It's completely crazy. Because we have different parties, different ministers, with different politics and different narratives, do you know? For example, government have support from two left parties, but in last time one of this left is opposition, another left is government. We have to know it's, and each these parties have own candidates in presidential election. And our problem that we have coalition moderate conservatives, but it's two parties with fight between. Do you know, it's completely crazy. And the strongest party, party Donald Tusk, have problem with this consensus and doing bills in parliament and so. And this situation that's not good working government, and for populist is the good pretext for them that too much this party left, gender is feminist and so on. We have one voice, right voice, and will be ordered, do you know?
Problem of the coalitions.
Yes.
But at least you won the parliamentary elections for the coalition.
As Professor Jasiecki has only 5 minutes in front of him, I will accept only two over questions, and one here and over in back side. Please.
You didn't see the young.
Yes, the youngest one. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. This will be more of a commentary than a question. I need to play the devil's advocate in this situation because as a reaction to neoliberal technocracy, we also witness the rise of left-wing populist parties, which in your analysis are not included. And we've seen that those parties, for example, don't need to be anti-liberal or anti-pluralism, so that's interesting. And maybe another question is why on these grievances, mostly economic, are the right that capitalizes, but that's more broad. So that's it.
Want to answer? Yeah, okay, there's the two in some. Okay, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Quick question about the need to strengthen the nation state. I think you make the point is we need to do that in relation to corporations. I think we fundamentally underestimate and under-research the power of corporations and their influence on the present moment. But I'm worried about the push against migration, which is seen as part of this strengthening of the nation state. So how do we balance those twin impulses?
Yes, thank you for this question. Problem that, for example, like migration, our government in this moment is more strong after migration than peace government. It's paradoxes, because our liberal politicians, like in Germany and in many other countries, give this postulate from right parties in new programs. And for example, is another question. For example, war in Gaza. And our government said there is possible with Netanyahu go to Poland, do you know? And we support international judges in one side, another, you know, this invitation completely nonsense in this case. But in this government we have too much these kinds of politics. For example, I am advisor in business organization, different NGOs and so on. And many supporters of the new government believe that politics changes will be more democratic than under peace government. But in practice, no. Only Donald Tusk and his advisor and problems because, for example, we have many institutions for consultation, but this institution don't working because Prime Minister have another priorities. And for many people, it's bad situation. For example, postulate ever situation of women. No changes. No new bills, do you know? Because in coalition we have different approaches. This kind of situation, many different dimensions in politics. For me is very bad because I see that this kind of policy is without future, not progressive. It's only fighting these old men like Tusk and Kaczyński, and especially in young men in Poland, young men and women, at the moment more support another parties, more radical left or more radical right, because they don't continue this duopoly. Kaczyński contra Tusk is a big problem. It's the same situation. We don't know exactly what is really, because I'm not optimist like minister, because minister is a member of government, it's normal, but I am sociologist. I know many different approaches, not clear with the question. Maybe thank you, because I'm not.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Can you review your current presentation?
And of course, we are supposed to be neutral, but I would say that when we listen to you, we are very pleased to have some experts. So we have to protect our experts, maybe. And I'm sorry, because it's a topic very important for our populist friends. Thank you very much, Professor. And now, Professor Ozturk, you have the mission to make your presentation in 15 minutes, and I want to apologize for Bülent. Probably if you want to ask a question to directly in the lobby with Professor, but I have to pay attention to the time. So, Professor Ozturk, you have the floor.
Can you please do a favor to me? Then I change my slide.
Okay.
Can you change for me? Thank you very much. Needed a change in the microphone system here, maybe. Hi everybody. So we are all wondering what kind of globalization, global economic system is emerging, rising right now. What kind of market economy system we are going to have in the near future under the rising authoritarian populism. So in order to find out the answer for that one, recently I am conducting a research by considering major populist leaders around the world. So, although there are very much long list of populist politicians in the world, I concentrated only Trump, Bolsonaro, but also Da Silva Lula. Although he's a left-wing politician, he has many populist orientations, but I see his populism rather a positive direction, let me say progressive populism somehow. Also, I consider Viktor Orban, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, and Modi of India. Why? Because we want to make some generalization, right? This is the way science progresses. Although it is risky to make such a generalization, especially when we think of populist politicians, it is quite dangerous to make generalization, because by definition, populism is not a strong ideology. It is based upon the individual charisma of politician himself. So every politician has different perspective, way of doing things, crafting political power when they come into the power. Therefore, generalization is very difficult, but on the other hand, we have to find some common patterns to be able to predict what kind of globalization or market economy might evolve in the near future. Indeed, early conceptualization of populism in economics started in the early 1990s in the Latin American context, when one after another left-wing governments came into the power there. They wanted to change establishment by concentrating on losers, poor segment of society. So they emphasized on the redistributive policies to vulnerable, weaker groups. They focused on high growth, yes, but not through sustainable policies. They used expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, and they tended to protect national industries, and they increased direct government intervention through public economic enterprises. So at the beginning, many of those policies brought really good outcomes, but in the short run. In the long term, those policies became very much destructive in the form of inflation which went beyond control. Still in Argentina, the same situation persists, and accumulation of non-sustainable public as well as private debt, and many political and social instabilities resulted. That means even if you have good intention at the beginning of your governance, through those unsustainable populist policies in economics, most of the time you are going to create outcomes which are worse than the previous situation. It happened in Latin America. Based upon that one, there is Dornbusch, who is the almost single scientist at that time who made research on those problems. He said that yes, in the short run benefit, in the long run more pain. But now, with the changing nature, we can say that as right or left-wing populists are repeating the same problem with changing nature. Of course, history does not 100% repeat itself. Yes, there is a repetition of history, but with changing nature, and we want to see if we are going to have, let's say, a similar decade of 1960s, when there was quite strong protectionism, nation-state approach to economic development, somehow with national autonomy, etc. We don't know what will happen, but I can mention a couple of common points between left or right-wing populists, also some different aspect of their approach to economics. I'm not going to go into details, but just I will summarize the main orientations. So in terms of common points, they are of course anti-establishment, but rather than reforming the establishment, they try to overtake it and create their own establishment. In that regard, they are not progressive at all. In second, they are nationalistic, so they put very much emphasis on protecting national industries. Somehow, to some extent, depending on the political economic conjuncture, they are sometimes against foreign capital, but sometimes they are pro-foreign capital. So we cannot say that right and left-wing politicians are against foreign capital. It is context dependent, indeed. It was different in the past. Also, they call for reshoring jobs rather than offshoring the companies to protect domestic markets and opposing foreign ownership sometimes, not every time. Third point, they disregard, of course, institutional constraints. Professor Jasiecki put so much emphasis on that. I completely agree. They are against the rule of law. They are against autonomous institutions such as autonomous central bank, competition authority, etc. They are against also untouchable property rights. They also against the transparent procurement law, and they manipulate competitive environment as well. They are so much clientelistic and open to patronage relationship. Therefore, they would like to use public procurement and allocation of public licenses to cooperate with local capital owners to keep their power. Therefore, their policies target not transparent, eligible, fair competition, but they try to overtake existing control of the existing companies and existing capital. A very special form of controlling corporations is evolving right now in Turkey. As you know, there are mainly two categories of ownership. One category is public ownership. The second category is private ownership. The third category has evolved under China right now, which ownership belongs to the state, but management belongs to the private CEOs. So therefore, yes, public corporations should be managed with the soil of the market economy. This is the way China is gradually shifting from central planning to the market economy. But the fourth way of ownership right now is evolving in Turkey. Theoretically speaking, corporations are private companies, but all board of the companies are replaced by Erdogan's retired bureaucrats. So this is the very unique way of inventing establishment of control on the companies. Yes, private, the risk on the private ownership, but directly managed and influenced by political appointments to the company boards. This is a really interesting evolving partnership and ownership structure. And of course, short-termism is their common denominator. In order to get voter satisfaction in the short term through subsidies, pensions, etc. But in the long term, they avoid necessary reforms, which might be finally more costly at the end of the process. For instance, let me give you two important examples, one from the United States, one from, again, Turkey. Donald Trump puts emphasis on only tariff war to make America great again. But I compared current tariff level globally. Yes, tariff level in the United States is really lower, but other countries are also implementing quite low level of tariff to the United States. Yes, there are a couple of countries, including China, India, who really implement comparably little level, higher level of tariff. But he established a global war against the rest of the world, not only on China and India. But the problem in the United States is not that tariff problem. The problem is structural and reforming of the U.S. Economic system. Donald Trump does not talk about 2008 financial crisis. He doesn't talk about mortgage economic crisis. He doesn't talk about reforming existing U.S. capital structure. He doesn't talk about taxation of wealth. He doesn't talk about establishing more regulation on increasingly more monopolized technological feudalism. So therefore, he is manipulating society that the problem is outsiders. He is creating scapegoats to take attention from real problems to artificially created agenda to collect voter loyalty, but in the long run he is completely postponing the real problems. The much more similar problem happened in Turkey a couple of years ago. The inflation in Turkey was around 20%, and also policy rate of the central bank was almost at 20%. The solution to decrease inflation, to take inflation under control, was to increase central bank rates a little bit higher. Then gradually, when inflation goes down, then policy rate would follow it. Then after a couple of months, inflation would be taken under control. Because 20% of inflation was extremely higher as compared to the rest of the world at that time. World average was around 2%. Similar countries' inflation, similar to Turkey, was around less than 5% and 20% in Turkey. Solution was quite obvious, but Erdogan said, no, the problem is not that. The problem is that interest rate is very high, and according to the religion of Islam, interest is banned, so we cannot implement high interest rate policy. I am going to eliminate interest rate. And he ordered central bank to either quit or implement his orders. And he destroyed central bank autonomy, decreased interest rate from 20% to almost 10%, and inflation went from 20% to 100% within a couple of months. Even if those figures are manipulated by Turkey's Statistical Institute. Either legal or illegal, but somehow inflation went beyond control. And we all know that. This is not something unpredictable. As a science of economics, we know that in that situation, interest rates should be increased, not decreased, but by abusing religious emotions, nostalgia, or belief, he manipulated the environment, concentrated all attention on high interest rate, and what is the result? Not only the inflation went beyond control, but also he transferred a huge amount of wealth to those who who borrowed from state banks at subsidized interest rate. Even if you are a line for capital owner, company owner, when you go to public banks, you are denied to get this borrowing at subsidized interest rate. This debt was given to only his elite businessman at that subsidized level, and now the cost of life has gone beyond control, budget deficit has gone beyond control, and Turkey's central bank reserves completely evaporated, and increasing, he is going to become more and more authoritarian because there is no more reasonable solution for Turkey. So what I am trying to say is that in the short term benefit, in the long term they completely ignore, sacrifice the required reform of the economy. In terms of key differences, I am not going to go into details, but in terms of their ideological foundation, economic objective, targeted economic groups, trade policy, the role of the state in economics, social spending are not similar to each other. They are really different, but I'm not going to spend so much time on that. Just what I would like to underline is that recently there is not so much emphasis on Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, who argued at the beginning of 1990s that future wars will take place between different civilizations, not because of different ideologies, but because of economic interest, but just because of different civilizational competition. Indeed, if you ask me, civilizational populism, very much a repetition of that thesis, I believe. So if we find civilizational populism something important to discuss, then definitely we have to give reference to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. What kind of globalization might emerge from now on? As you know, after 1980s, there were many economic reforms to open markets, privatization, foster free trade, support small governments, and less state intervention. So we experienced a really radical state of globalization since 1980s. But that process of globalization was not under control. As we learned from Karl Polanyi, as we learned from Fernand Braudel long before, and more recently from Joseph Stiglitz or Danny Rodrik, uncontrolled competition, uncontrolled capital would undermine democracy as well as market economy in the long run. Because market economy is not something God-given. Market economy is institutionalized, is created by human action, government action, public action. So deinstitutionalization, deregulation of markets would definitely end up with authoritarianism. Why? Winners are powerful companies and losers are a huge number of citizens. And in the passage of time, they lose their positive expectation to establishment, they lose their hope, they feel they are lost, they feel they are forgotten, they left behind. Then they start listening different unusual voices, even if they are not sustainable in the long run. Therefore, in the long run, capitalism or capital is the enemy of market economy itself, democracy itself, and now we are repeating the same process once again. So there is a confusion here. If when you start talking about democracy and market economy, we are expected that we should automatically support capitalism. That is not correct. That is not correct. Capitalism is the enemy of market economy. Capitalism is the enemy of democracy as well. They must be taken under control through real reforms, but Donald Trump does not talk about all those things. No populist politician talk about all those things indeed. Their strategies are economic nationalism, cultural protectionism, redistributive promises to keep voter loyalty by the way, and exclusionary welfare policies to local people, to their true citizens, not to foreign groups, etc. But there are results, just let me summarize them to understand what is coming on the horizon. Rather than emphasizing on economic efficiency, they emphasize on security. Therefore, security-related economic structure is evolving now. Rather than reshoring this company's supply chain to the most competitive countries, they try to do it in nearby friend countries through friend shoring. Rather than multilateralism, they focus on bilateralism or regional economic integration. They also expand state intervention, especially in energy, technology, and food. I think there will be a global fight regarding rare earth minerals, supply of food, and critical technologies and energy. Yes, you can take your picture. I am waiting for it. And 5, technological and financial decoupling will be very much heightened because of rise of technological sovereignty, consideration in China, Russia, in the United States, fragmentation of global financial system, and the rise of new economic blocs like United States, European Union versus China, Russia, maybe between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, but these are all under discussion right now. Of course, another result is migration and labor market impact. When you restrict immigration, then there will be, of course, declining remittance to those poor countries. Really, there are some poor countries who are getting huge benefit from the remittances, will not be able to get it anymore. When people are not allowed to go to industrial countries, how labor shortages will be resolved, and wage and salaries will rise in industrial countries as well, which trigger the hollowing out of industry to China back once again. So skilled labor shortage for multinational companies will become even more bigger problem. Of course, supply chain resilience will become a very important issue. It will shift from efficiency to security, as I mentioned. Nearshoring, friendshoring will replace offshoring, structuring of supply chain. Government control on critical sectors will be intensified. Of course, there will be growing risk of instability such as trade war, currency war, the rise of capital controls, less interdependence, higher political risk will be our coming agenda indeed. So let me conclude that the result of the civilizational populism in economic is that it will result in global disintegration, supply chain, trade remain under strain, domestic polarization will also be triggered, labor, welfare and immigration policies will secure. And as a case study, European migration crisis because of cultural and labor market implication will be intensified in Europe. In that regard, I don't see any sustainable solution. On the one hand, under the fear of rising right-wing governments, there will be more and more restriction on the immigrants. But on the other hand, there is a huge gap of required skilled labor, how Europe is going to integrate them, assimilate them, bring them. It is a complete great question mark. Efficiency gives way to security and ideology. And of course, we will have a new version of globalization. Rather than a fully integrated global economy, we are going to have more fragmented, regionalized, politicized globalization, which is closely associated with civilizational conflict, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Your presentation was very rich, and first of all, thank you because you answered the question in my presentation at the beginning, because we have a new form of globalization and built by this new populist leaders. And I should like to maybe to give the floor, if Professor Auslan Scheider doesn't mind, so that we might have any question. And I will be, and Bulent will be the first one because he was frustrated, I know. But I will ask you a question. We are used to facing a lot of populist leaders who prefer to criticize expert technocrats, that very rich CEOs. And particularly because they seem to target only people that they could represent as probably against their own vision of globalization. And there are not a lot of criticism against very rich people. And as President, Dr. Jasiecki told us, we are facing in this neoliberal globalization more and more social inequalities. And I'm always very fascinated by the fact that the scapegoats are much more central banks, much more technocrats than the very, very big business CEOs. How can you maybe describe that in countries you have studied, and how can you explain that?
Yes, you reminded me something very crucial issue. So when we talk about, when we concentrate on the immigration problem in Europe, it means we are not talking about any serious problem, because it is a complete scapegoating of the real problems. So, in order to take the rise of right-wing parties under control to please society, then we concentrate on immigration problem. But we, at the moment, I'm living in Germany and I'm following major problems there. Nobody's talking about structural problems in Germany. Cost of energy, idle, non-working, unmotivated bureaucracy, cost of land, cost of construction, cost of regulation. Nobody is talking about it. When you focus on immigration, then you can postpone all problems. Therefore, that is from my perspective, this is the biggest problem. When you do not take capital under control, when you do not increase competition in the market, when you do not prevent the rise of technological feudalism, then those problems will become even deeper and deeper. But just if you concentrate on immigrants as scapegoats, then you will postpone many problems. That is quite a dangerous aspect of thinking about issues right now.
Thank you, Bülent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the exciting and very intriguing presentation. My question is philosophical, actually.
I'm not philosopher, however.
But everybody is philosophical. I am looking for solution aspect, both the national level and the international level. So when we are looking for a solution, the first name that came to my mind is John Rawls from again the liberal thought circles. And he suggests that his thesis that in this iconic 1971 a theory of justice, saying that liberalism is very good at production, but very bad at
allocation.
So I can have 15 minutes. And he suggests numbers of proposals. In order to make the system national level, market level, there should be some revisions on the liberal thinking. He suggests a kind of social justice system with some social experiments, and revising the system. So I want to ask the question whether the John Rawls, if you are familiar with his ideas, could be a solution for far right's abuse of liberal market economy and the liberalism or neoliberalism. Could be a solution, a remedy for this exploitation of neoliberal and the liberal thinking and its instruments, both the national level and the global level, because it easily could be extended to the global sphere. Thank you.
Indeed, that kind of solution is already under discussion globally, because with the rise of artificial intelligence, technological improvements, the cost of production, according to some statistics, the cost of production in manufacturing, especially in the United States, in Europe, would go down at least by 35% with the implementation of artificial intelligence. So this will be a very big jump in technological frontiers, which means the cost of labor will not be a big trigger of global reshoring of the capital. We don't need China anymore just because labor is cheaper in China. From now on, we need Chinese domestic market, not cost of production in China. So based on that idea, some experts suggest that a global citizenship salary or wage should be implemented. So without looking at your identity or without looking if you are earning enough or not, since you are a citizen, since you are a human being, you are guaranteed a basic level of life, whether you are earning something or not. So that would eliminate basic anxiety, basic concern for the future. I think it is on the way. I think it will come somehow, but who will take that leadership? We don't know. At the moment, no political leader is now pronouncing that kind of solution. But my expectation is in that direction you mentioned.
So, thank you for your answer, Professor Ozturk. I will give you the floor. I'm really sorry.
Yes.
We are not populists, we study populists, so probably we don't need any leader. So I suppose that you could organize yourself. I'm very sorry. I want first of all to apologize to Professor Scheider, because I would have been pleased to listen to a presentation, but unlikely I'm expected in the French embassy for a meeting concerning exchanges, so I will have to leave, but I will come back in 1 hour. And so you will replace me.
Establishment. Good.
And thank you very much for switching.
I am candidate to your chair now.
Yes, you will be elected immediately. Thank you to have replaced the debate at the philosophical level, and thank you, Professor, also to have told us that we have 3 globalization in the history, and when we are in the Stala Biblioteca here, we could, of course, notice that the globalization of our days is not the same, and I'm sorry because I am under pressure of Adam Smith, as I said, and Professor Scheider has a picture of Adam Smith. So as I said, it was also linked with the liberalism and the discussion about the globalization of the 18th century. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Would you like to come here? Maybe much easier.
Whatever works best.
Yeah.
I suppose. Okay. All the logistics. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, I would like to start.
Valentina, sorry, could you please teach us how to pronounce your surname?
Actually, everybody who said it did it fine. It's Außerlachida. I know it's very complicated, and Austrians struggle too, so it's not just internationals. But yeah, thanks for the question anyways. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers and the team for having done such a fantastic job over the last 1.5 days, and for the invite that I'm allowed to talk about my work today. Well, I started out by wanting to talk about my book, which got published last year. But then I was asked how to link this to civilizational populism, which I will end up doing in the very last point of the presentation. So here, a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the rise of the recent rise of the far right, specifically starting in 2016. I'm going to provide you with my argument, where I'm very happy to have a debate about if you disagree, and actually it's quite nice to talk now after my 2 colleagues, because I don't think we agree on all the things. I'm going to provide you with some discourse excerpts of far-right leaders and how they articulate their program, and I think what I think that tells us about them. And finally, how if we look at far-right populism, we should really understand it as a state-building project rather than anything else. And then I end up, ideally convincingly, provide my perspective on what I think that civilizational populism helps us to understand in that respect, and what we can do about, thinking about these things in relation to neoliberalism. So all of this research started in 2016 when I started my PhD. It was my PhD project, really. And when 2016 hit and the Brexit referendum happened and Donald Trump got into power for the first time, there was a lot of political scientists not only being extremely surprised about what is happening in all of these countries, but also coming up with a multitude of explanation of how this could have possibly happened. And now, of course, for a very long time, for decades really, and most importantly after the first 2 world wars, we had this long-standing explanation for the rise of the far right, which stems from socioeconomic insecurities. This idea that if you're not particularly satisfied with your socioeconomic status and your socioeconomic standing, you might be much more volatile to be mobilized by far-right leaders for more resentful, for more reactionary type of politics. Now, when 2016 happened, we had most famously Inglehart and Norris write about the cultural backlash thesis and how they thought it's not about economics at all. It's all about nationalism, it's all about anti-migration, and really it's all about a reaction to progressive values along the lines of multiculturalism, of cosmopolitanism, and how these things make people feel displaced in their cultural, traditional identities, and how that really fostered and drove the far right and their voting. Now, if you look at that literature, these decades and decades of political science literature, what you'll find is that these explanations very much dichotomize and polarize culture on the one side and economics on the other. So it's either socioeconomic inequality and dissatisfaction, or it's culture. But by no means there's any reconciliation. It's either or, which I think is quite an interesting way of thinking about the world. Because if you actually look at the far right specifically and the way in which they talk to people and mobilize these votes, these two things are not separate at all. They're actually very much interlinked and deeply intertwined. And what I do in my book is at length suggesting that that type of discourse, this intertanglement of cultural values with economic ideas, can very powerfully not only mobilize electorates, but rebuild state institutions through a very specific idea of nationalism. And I call these types of ideas exclusionary in nature. So I suggest to move beyond this sort of culture versus economy framing by saying that these nationalist and nativist values, which are very exclusionary, are deeply intertwined with economic rationale and logics. And specifically, in the case that I looked at, most importantly, Austria, where I am from, and which has one of the longest histories of far-right populism being in government as early as 1983 in Europe, post-World War II, that they actually were part and parcel of fostering neoliberalization. So they were the party to bring in neoliberal ideas such as low taxation, fiscal conservatism, welfare state entrenchment, and enabling of the market mechanisms. So it wasn't the conservatives necessarily, it really was the far right in this case. And that is what I term exclusionary neoliberalism. So we've heard a lot about neoliberalism, but we don't really have a good idea of what neoliberalism does other than facilitating market economy. And if we look at the far right, I bring you two examples. One of these examples is a picture that I took on the 8th of April because Vienna just had regional elections. The outcomes of these regional elections were actually quite favorable, I have to say. But nevertheless, the Austrian far-right populist party, Austrian Freedom Party, did come second place. They were very strong. And here is a picture that I took which says, more police station instead of millions for asylum, right? So the message is quite clear. There's this clear-cut prioritization of national security over any sort of immigration. And the last sentence said, that is only fair, right? So there's a sort of economic rationale around fairness around this, right? Then I brought you a discursive excerpt from 1994. This is from the manifesto, and it says, multicultural experiments are the old Marxist theory of redistribution, and we all know redistribution has always been bad because it always meant more poverty for all. So what you can see here quite clearly is that there is a moralization of different kinds of economic ideas which feed into a notion of that the welfare state and the nation state should be something that ideally is best structured as a neoliberal state. So what I then go to show over the history since the establishment of the Austrian Freedom Party from 1956 until 2017 is the making of what I call the exclusionary neoliberal state. So while we have quite a few accounts already on how there is this idea, and we've heard two of these accounts, or at least one of them earlier today, around how authoritarianism and far right is the natural outcome of neoliberalization. My point is a little bit that far right populists actually, and this is it's not necessarily argued a lot, because usually we relate neoliberalization to conservatives like Reagan and Thatcher, rather than the far right populists. So I argue that far right populist actors actively engage in the construction of a neoliberal state that facilitates exclusionary policies through nationalist and nativist ideas. As I said, Austria was my case study, where you can clearly see this happening, where they, in the 1980s, for the first time, bring neoliberal ideas into government in a coalition with the Social Democrats, interestingly, where they then go on in their second government participation in 2000 to implement that neoliberal exclusionary state a little bit later than the rest of Europe, but very much pushed by that government. And finally, when they got into power after 2008, they then sought to sustain the exclusionary neoliberal state after the challenge that the great financial crisis of 2008 posed for neoliberal institutions. Now, my argument is this is not only happening in Austria. We have a comparative outlook that tells us that we have very similar discourses and very similar governing outcomes in other countries. Most importantly, Hungary has been explained as national mutation of neoliberalism, or a national populist neoliberalism. We have the UK in the case of Brexit, which utilized global trade arguments for taking back national control. And we have the US, at least during the first Trump presidency, which was described as a reactionary, neoliberalist and nationalist exclusionary government. So now, of course, one could ask, and I think we have heard this just in the previous presentation, you might ask, okay, what is the universal characteristics of these cases, and what are the real differences if we agree that one of the core ideological features of far-right populism is nationalist exclusion? So how can we square that? How can we square this universal observation versus these nationalist differences? And when I then ended up engaging with civilizational populism, I think it gives us quite a good hint, because I think what civilizational populism allows us to do is going beyond nationalism as the only one core identification mechanism within far-right populist discourse. Now, of course, we have talked also yesterday a lot about definitions of populism, and I think what I saw all of the presentations broadly agreeing on, that it uses an antagonistic logic, pitting the people against the elites or the other, broadly speaking, in order to build a sort of political identity, right? Always when we say what we are and what we are not, we are identifying with or against something. So it's really a process of identification. And of course, with far-right populism, we often then talk about the people being this authentic national unity versus the other, which is very much defined and characterized through nationalist exclusion. And so nationalism was sort of framed as this one exclusionary characteristic, also in the case of far-right neoliberalism, as I suggest. But I think civilizational populism allows us to widen that identity construct, and thus its exclusion. So it is not just about national exclusion, it's also about the incompatibility of different cultures, which is a bit more broad than nationalism would believe us to be. And so it might possibly be a better or more precise explanation for the universal and different characteristics that we see of the far right across the globe. So when we widen this exclusionary characteristics through civilizational populism, it's probably most important to really focus on the anti-plural form of populist politics that is for the authentic inhabitants of the land, that may or may not adopt a religious identity. We heard a lot about religion yesterday, but I think, for instance, in the case of Austria, the far right, they sometimes claim Christian values, but really they're not making a lot of politics for religious ends and means, right? So I think it's more of a anti-something else. And I think this anti-something else is exactly what I mean by widening the scope of exclusion. So it may be about nativism, it may be about traditional gender identities, it may be about sexuality, as well as religion. So I think, of course, having shown that the far right and their exclusionary nationalist identities and politics also have an effect on economic policy making, I would assume that the same would be true for civilizational populism. And I think what we can see with civilizational populism is very much a sociological insight on the way in which identification works. Identities have layers. So if I am speaking to a fellow Austrian and they ask me where I belong to or how I identify, I might be more keen to tell them about the region that I come from. However, in this international context, if someone asks me where I am from, I'll probably only say Austria, because the likelihood of someone knowing the region that I'm from is quite slim. And I think the same can be said about the function of civilizational populism within far-right populist discourse. So you have economic policy implications that are associated with it through this multi-layered nature of identification processes. So of course you have your good old nativist and nationalist exclusion, which I think are mostly debated when we talk about economic policy impact, because this is what people are most worried about, right? The trade tariffs, the economic nationalist kind of ideas. But you can also see this with welfare state chauvinism, with the cutting the spending of immigration, asylum and integration measures, as well as trying to grant state spending to only the authentic inhabitants of Austria only. And more regionally, what we can see is that the regional exclusion goes beyond the national borders, where, for instance, the Austrian Freedom Party is very much a huge fan of the Fortress Europe. And you could see the same in the UK, where the UK was very much, yes, a nationalist ideological discourse, but it was not just that, it was about taking back control of the region itself, which is the British Isles. So it goes beyond this nationalist type of trend. And it is to protect mostly globalization measures that we heard about earlier today already, as well as immigration specifically from the global south and non-Christian cultures, specifically also in relation to Islamophobia, which a lot of different political scientists have shown to be the common uniting theme across the far right in Europe. Of course, again, Brexit as a case in point that all of these taking back control and regional exclusionary ideas have a massive impact on the way in which we think about current political economy and economic policy making. So, finally, and hopefully in time, I hope to show that far-right populism is far beyond so much more than a cultural project in reaction to progressive values, but actually a state-building project to the highest extent. That here we really have to consider what kind of economic ideas and ideologies these people are actually portraying and pursuing, because this is certainly something that we can see now unraveling quickly and really maybe oriented us towards a new version of globalization. And finally, I think civilizational populism is a really neat concept to make us think about the way in which nationalist exclusion, the rise of the far right across the globe, as well as the type of policies that they're actually pursuing, help us to understand the universality as well as the differences across cases. And I leave an open question here because I think it's a really prevalent one, and I think that we already had a hint today of what this might mean. There's a real question whether we still live in a neoliberal time. So my book is about neoliberalism. I've spent 6 years of my life researching neoliberalism. At this point in time, I'm no longer entirely sure whether we would want to call this neoliberal. We had this debate a lot of times before, most prominently after the crisis of 2008, where we had publications coming out about, is this a crisis in or of neoliberalism? But today, and the type of political elites that we increasingly see in governments in very powerful positions such as the United States, makes me think that maybe we might want to have a new debate of that. And I'll end here and very much look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
So, as a self-appointed moderator of the day, now I am opening floor to the discussions. May I get your contributions? Any candidate? Yes, please.
again. So it's a question for both of you. We obviously see that people from lower classes with this kind of discourse are practically voting against their own interest, we could say. So do you have any idea or explanation what's the mechanism that makes people vote and select politicians in this way? So could it be disinformation? Could it be, I don't know, lack of class consciousness, we could call it that way? Is it maybe how we are viewing the world and the position of the ideology? So what's your opinion?
That's a quite big question for me, so please answer this question.
Shall I go?
Aristotle thought about that during the small Greek city-states, how to improve the efficiency of vote and voters, how to increase their wisdom and conscience. But until today, there is no solution to that one. Neither I have that. So sorry.
I think that's a great question. And I struggle with the question a lot because exactly that is the case in point. If you have a state rebuilding project that is massively facilitated through people who don't necessarily win from the type of economic policies that are being put forward, the left behind place argument and the socioeconomic deprivation argument become very hard to pursue, right? Because we can no longer assume the type of characteristics and attitudes that political science sort of puts on the type of voter attitude characterizations. I think there are two answers to that. One is discursive. If you listen to the far right, they very much suggest that they are going to make the best of worlds for the small people, right? So there's a really powerful discourse around fairness and unfairness and how they will really uphold these classes that are now disadvantaged unfairly so. So there's a discursive promise. Whether that is true or not, or whether they follow through with it in that sense at election level, doesn't really matter. It is what they say and people believe, right? And the second one, and I think this is a more subversive ideological mechanism, which I think is actually very much about neoliberalism and deeply entrenched neoliberal ideas, is this idea of meritocracy. So we have fantastic statistical analysis around the role of meritocracy, for instance, in welfare state attitudes, where the scholars have been able to show that if you are in the US, for instance, you're more likely to be against more welfare state spending than if you are elsewhere. So you have this sort of attitudinal basis where you can prove that even in more unequal societies, people therefore are not necessarily for more welfare states, because they truly believe that whatever their own standing is a performance question and is something that is about to be deserved. And this is, I think, linking back nicely to far-right discourse, because far-right discourse doesn't do anything else but constructing deservingness. With all the policies that they put forward, they talk about deservingness, who deserves something and who doesn't. The migrants don't, but the Austrians do. It's all about who deserves something, and a lot within that neoliberal ideas, making the national market work for the deserving Austrians. And that's, I think, why the far right is very successful in mobilizing, maybe paradoxically, votes that are not benefiting from the vote. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer, but I'm afraid we have to close the session because I am ordered by body language, by Shema, to stop at this stage. So, because we have already...
Very, very quick one.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
The previous question, which I think, follow up to the previous question, which I think is very important, but if you could focus, I don't know if you or any of you, on the other side, namely what the left has not been doing well.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent they've been focused perhaps too much on questions of identity rather than forgetting class as a very important dimension of identity, and sort of drifting towards this, what Nancy Fraser calls, I think, progressive neoliberalism. What could be done from that point of view? Thank you.
It's a big issue, yes. Yes, I agree with you indeed. Can you imagine that Donald Trump, who is himself a capitalist, is talking about helping the losers, creating their long-term oriented anxieties, feeling of being left behind. You should expect it from a left-wing oriented politician, right? By talking about class differences, labor rights, etc. And now in the United Kingdom, a left-wing government came to the power, but with a big disappointment, if you ask me. Yes, there are small progresses, contributions, etc. But in terms of real reformation of the system, there is simply nothing. And they are going now. If you ask me, they are also being recirculated now. Because they cannot focus on the real ideology of left. Still they are shy of supporting left-oriented ideology, etc., etc.
Sounds like a complete agenda here.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe one addition. I agree that the left really struggles to find their own political identity. Sometimes I'm a bit overwhelmed with the massive argumentation that comes along, because we also live in a time where, on the one hand, global structural pressures are very tough for the left to square. And I think part of what we can see with Keir Starmer, or more broadly the Labour Party in the UK most prominently, and this idea of Corbyn that he had to, revamp the nostalgia for the 1960s, 70s Labour Party. I think there's a real question around whether this type of politics will work in a globalized, integrated market world. So I think that there is not just the ideological base that they've lost, but also broader global question. And I think what I personally think that the left has not realized, and there is some great work done by Flanders and Halikopoulos, I'm sorry if I butchered the name, but they brought out a sort of report about, what the left can learn. And what they focus on is saying the left will never be able to beat the far right on their own terms. So if the left starts being nationalist and anti-migration, people are not starting to then flock to the left. So I think this is something that's a mistake that I've seen across Social Democrat and Labour parties around the world, where they believe they have to beat these policy issues on their agenda. And I think that's where they really struggle.
Why would you vote for a limitation if you have no...
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. When the questions are so much challenging, I start talking to myself, okay, rather than this is my way of doing things. Sorry. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your contribution. It was very wonderful. I'm sorry to intervene, but it's a good news. You can continue discussion with the coffee and cookies outside. We will be here in 15 minutes. Very punctual and sharp.
Thank you very much, Valentina, for your excellent presentation.
Well, thank you.